So, today we're making pie. Okay, not that kind of pie. A real pie. What flavor, you ask? Well, the most delicious, of course. Carbon emission pie. Eh? Oh yeah. It'll be delicious, don't worry, come on. So, as you've, I'm sure, figured out, we're gonna be making our pie based on this recipe. Pinterest perfect, right? I know. While we make this pie, we're gonna be talking about what are all these carbon emissions. And just like in my last video, we talked about the first step being stopping all carbon emissions. But we can't stop carbon emissions if we don't know what they are or where they come from. So, even though we'll be talking about them today, I just want to let you know that we will not talk about how to stop them. I will give brief summaries on what that may look like, but we're not going to get into how to stop carbon emissions just yet. I just want to get a full in-depth understanding of what they are and where they come from. So, once we're on the same page, we can talk about how to stop them. That being said, let's make our pie. We need a mixing bowl, Check our pie. I can't see because of the ring light. Like, I can't look at anything else, and it's just the things I do for you guys. So our first ingredient is our most important ingredient, and it's electricity generation. And of course, electricity generation has really moved our world into a new one, and it powers everything that makes us today. But it does have carbon emissions of its own, and that's mainly from how it's originally generated. So what happens is fossil fuels are burned and used to create steam. And that steam then turns turbines, which creates that electricity. But it's that original use of fossil fuels that give it all those carbon emissions. And because we use electricity for nearly everything, it's why it's one of our biggest ingredients. So as of 2017, actually, 64% of our electricity generation was based on fossil fuels. And that was all three fossil fuels: coal, oil, and methane. To eliminate this section of fossil fuels, we're going to have to shift our electricity's generation power source to something clean or renewable. Okay, let's see what our... Wow, those are peaches for you. So our next ingredient is agriculture and deforestation. And that takes up about 18% of our total pie. And it comes in three parts. So the first is deforestation. And this is mainly happening because we will burn down forests and land to create more agricultural suitable space. So we burn down these forests and vegetation, but they're all already holding carbon. So when we burn it, it releases that carbon again, and that's where those emissions come from. Our second comes from livestock themselves. And this is, believe it or not, because they fart and burp. I know. So livestock belch and fart methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's much more potent than carbon dioxide. And because it's so potent, this area alone takes up 5% of our total 18% for this section. I know, crazy. But our third one comes from the upkeep of farming practices themselves. So this is like soil and fertilizer and equipment that's used. And honestly, these are all outdated practices. There are new practices that could be put into place that would eliminate this area of emissions. But all in all, to get rid of this entire section, we need to reteach farming techniques, and we need to eat less meat to reduce the high demand of meat. There are also other technical developments in the works, but need a push to get out there more. So now we're moving on to transportation, which is about 15% of our pie. And even though this industry is really big and spread out and has a million companies and entities all with their hands in it, they all contribute to the same emissions. And that's because nearly all vehicles are powered by oil. And as we know, those fossil fuels equate to carbon emissions when they're burned. This section, though, is so big because of the frequency and intensity at which we burn these fossil fuels. I mean, this goes for every vehicle you can think of, from cars to planes to ships to tractors, all of it. In order to remove this section of emissions, we need to support and advocate for more technological advancements for this section. Our next piece of our pie is called industry, and it takes up about 12%. And this one's really interesting because it has to do with burning fossil fuels to make our everyday things. So this is like cement or steel, things that are ingrained in our daily lives that we don't really pay attention to initially, right? For example, to make cement, you have to heat the cement in a cement kiln. That's just the object that you use to heat it. But in order to heat it, you need power or heat to do so. And this is where we burn fossil fuels. So this area has a lot of technological developments, but it needs policies to implement them. So the next piece is industry process emissions, and this is about 7% of our pie. But this one is interesting because it doesn't have to do with the burning of fossil fuels to make something. It's more of the chemical reactions within a process of making those industry products. So if we take a closer look at cement, in order to make cement, you have to go through a process called calcination. And all this is when they heat limestone, it turns into two things, calcium oxide and CO2. And while that calcium oxide is used for whatever they need it for, that CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. And that's where those carbon emissions come from. And just like the industry area, this also needs more technological development, but with policy reinforcement in order to get rid of those. So this next piece of our pie is called building fuel use, and it's about 6% of our pie. So this has more to do with like everyday things within a building. So like space heating, water heating, cooking, furnaces, etc. And no, this doesn't mean I think you should never use your heater or you should never cook again. It's not really based on what you do. It's more of a collective amount of emissions that come from buildings in general. But we'll get into why that's not your fault in a minute. But unfortunately, just like the rest of these, we do need more technological development in order to eradicate this area of emissions. Boop. So even though it's a small percentage, the next piece of our pie is probably one of the most deadly. And it's called escaped methane. It takes up about 5% of our pie. And the reason this area is so deadly is because it's not at anyone's fault. There's no one person or entity or government saying this is what we're gonna do and it's bad. This is more because during extraction and distribution of methane, there are just leaks along the way. And it takes up its own enough percentage to be a whole slice of a pie. That's a little scary. So I mean, to eradicate this area, we could be like, yes, let's put in more policies to go look where these leaks are, but my favorite is if we just electrify any processes that need methane, then we won't ever have to extract or distribute methane. I just dropped my cardamom. No! I mean my escaped methane. Wow, my escaped methane escaped from my... I'm just saying, that was perfect. Okay. So our second to last piece of this pie is called fossil fuel processing, and it's 4% of our pie. And this happens because in order to extract fossil fuels from the ground, we need to power the machines that we use. And for that, we use fossil fuels. I know, what a cycle, right? So in order to eradicate this area of emissions, really what we need to do is electrify all processes that use these emissions, so that we don't have to use any of it. We could just explode it out of existence. So the last piece of our pie today, I know, so sad, is going to be waste, and it makes up about 3% of our pie. And this is really coming from all other sections. So this is the waste that's created that ends up giving off its own carbon emissions. So if we take farming, for example, any organic waste that comes from that area, as it decomposes, it'll release methane, and those are where those carbon emissions come from. So it's really just a pileup of waste that ends up giving out their own carbon emissions as they, get dealt with. But this area of emissions can be easily squashed by going back to those sections and transforming our techniques to not give off as much waste. Or we have actually new developments that help us reuse and recycle all of that waste. So either one will help. Now we mix it up. My tummy, yummy in my tummy. Oh yeah, it's gonna be so good. I really just made a pie so I could eat it. Let's look at that. Okay, now we just put all our pieces together. Woo, this is our pie. We can't forget about the pecan crumble top, okay? We can pretend that this sprinkle is people who don't believe in climate change. So now, if we just bake it and, speed up the process like we did with our environment, it'll be caught up with reality. Anyways, while we wait for our pie, I just want you to know that the pieces we talked about today are much more complex and interconnected than we discussed. So, if we think about our regular pie, we didn't just put peaches in one corner and then brown sugar right next to it and lemon juice on this side. They're much more interconnected and they play off of one another. And I'm just telling you this because I don't want you to go flaunting your knowledge without knowing the limitations of what I just told you today. All the information is still accurate, but we didn't get into how deep it can and does go. Secondly, I want you to know that this pie doesn't exist because you don't ride your bike to work instead of driving, or because you use the stove to feed your family. It's more company and government based. So it's more happening because these entities are choosing to make unethical decisions on where they get their power sources or how they make certain products. It's not an individual's fault. But because of that, just because it's not our fault doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. If you're asking Ariana the climate activist and not Ariana the chef, I would say we have more power than we ever get to tap into. As a community, our power comes from our voices and our wallets. Any company would fall to its knees if we demanded change while holding our dollar in front of its face. This concept is actually called moral bankruptcy. And by definition, it's when an entity has traded too many of its core values and then results in lost relationships. If we really think about it, everything that we talk about, everything that we post, everything we put our money to, everything we put energy towards, we support. So if we as a collective globe were to demand change while rethinking where we put all of our energy, we could transform the world into whatever we want. But it all starts with unification. And unification means that everybody has to be on the same page about both the problem and the solution. But now I'm rambling. You let me ramble. So let's go check on our pie. thank you so much for cooking with me today. I hope you got the most out of this video, like I will be doing with this pie. But please don't forget to subscribe, follow my website or my Instagram, and leave any questions or comments down below. Thank you so much for joining me again today, and I will see you next time. Sincerely, Ari.